Good day, everyone. My name is Maha Al-Junaidi, and I am a trainer for the Islamic Networks Group, which is commonly known as ING. I want to begin by thanking the Collaborative Inclusion Conference for the invitation to speak at this year's conference, as we did last year, about countering Islamophobia in education, which, as many of you may know, is an important and timely topic that has concerned Muslim Americans for decades. The outline for today's presentation will be as follows. We will begin by defining Islamophobia and looking at its roots, and then look at its impact on Muslim students and their families. We're going to spend the bulk of our time today on the topic of how to counter Islamophobia in your schools and in the classroom. We'll go over some important educator tools for countering Islamophobia, beginning with yourself, as well as provide tips for teaching and other educational sources. And we will conclude with suggestions for interacting with Muslim students and families. So let's go ahead and get started. Next slide. We will first begin by defining Islamophobia and examining its roots. Next slide. Islamophobia is essentially defined as anti-Muslim racism, and it involves viewing or portraying Muslims, and in some cases promoting Muslims, when we consider the Islamophobia network that are described in studies that have been done in the on the industry of Islamophobia, such as Fear Incorporated. This is the way that Muslims essentially are portrayed. They're portrayed as being monolithic and static, meaning that they are all the same and unchanging. They're often portrayed as separate and other, or different from other Americans, or even other people generally. They're portrayed as inferior to the West, as barbaric, irrational, primitive, and sexist, as violent, aggressive people who support terrorism, or as people who are engaged in a clash of civilization. And more recently, Islam is now seen as a political ideology that is cloaked as a religion, which is very problematic when you consider religious freedoms, liberties, and rights. When did Islamophobia start? Generally, when I ask this question, most people respond that it began post 9/11, when in fact it's much older than that, with the Crusades beginning around the year 1100. Next slide. We find that the images and stereotypes of Muslims as infidels and warring people promoted as early as the Crusades, which were a series of religious wars that were supported between the 11th and 13th centuries, which had the objective of recovering the Holy Land from Muslim rule. This view of Muslims, again, was reinforced with the beginning of European colonialism between the 1500s and 1900s, which was a period when a handful of European countries, primarily Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, colonized most non-European countries or regions, which continued until the late 20th century. European colonizers asserted their power over colonized people by defining themselves, Europeans, as smarter, more capable, and more human, and describing occupied people as backwards, primitive, exotic, and in need of civilizing. And they also cast those occupied people as enemies of Christianity and Western civilization. In the 20th and 21st centuries, we once again see the reinforcement of these negative images of Muslims, as well as the racialization of Muslims, much as other non-whites were racialized as barbaric, primitive, sexist, and violent. So it's not surprising that many people have these views after centuries of conditioning long before 9/11, just as they have similar views of other non-white groups. Next slide. So this trend has continued until today, when Islamophobia now has become systemic racism, which impacts Muslims in various institutions and in society at large. And it can be found in all major societal structures that include education, for example, where textbooks and other resources often cast Muslims as either antiquated, or incompatible with modernity, or sexist and oppressive towards women, or as violent terrorists, especially relating to 9/11. Literature, both fiction and nonfiction, generally portrayed Muslims as backwards and sexist. And there is a plethora of books about the problems with both Islam and Muslims. Critiques of Islam and Muslims are one thing, and those are oftentimes legitimate. Universalizing terrorism or misogyny as rooted in Islam and not in people and culture is an entirely different thing happening. It's the difference between saying this person is lazy and saying their culture, that person's culture leads to laziness, right? The latter implicates everyone belonging to that culture. The former is specific to the individual, and that's the problem. In media, coverage of Islam and Muslims is generally negative. A 2018 Washington Post study of tens of thousands of articles mentioning Muslims or Islam found that 78% are negative, even when the coverage wasn't about terrorism. Other studies have shown that news coverage of Muslims is more negative than of other minority groups. Also, terror attacks by Muslims in the US received 3.5 times as much media coverage as attacks by non-Muslims. In Hollywood, representation of Muslims and Arabs in Hollywood have consistently been stereotypical, as in the original Disney's Aladdin, but there are many other examples today. Video games are often based in the Middle East, and games like Prince of Persia reinforce Orientalist, stereotypical representations of Arabs and Muslims, and popular games like Call of Duty reinforce stereotypes that Muslims are bad guys or terrorists. We also have Islamophobic campaigns across the country in recent years that have targeted the building of new mosques and other cultural issues that some of you might be familiar with, like the halal turkeys are taking over Thanksgiving holiday and so forth. And all of this, of course, leads to biased government policies, such as the Muslim ban that was targeting Muslims, again, based on a racialized view of all of them as being a security threat. Next slide. So it's no wonder that many people today internalize these attitudes, since all of these societal influences lead to the adoption of stereotypes, both good and bad, that can influence a person's subconscious and even override their values, which is demonstrated in various studies. That means that even if you don't believe that you're someone who's biased or racist, your subconscious can make you behave in biased or racist ways. And this is especially true in times of fear or stress. Now let's take a look, next slide. Let's take a look at the impact of all of these factors on Muslim students and their families. Next slide. As shown by the following and numerous polls, negative views of Muslims continue to be pervasive in the United States. A 2019 YouGov poll found only 15% of Americans have a favorable view of Islam, which is very low. 37% have an unfavorable view. In another poll, 2017 Pew Summary of Reports found that 41% of Americans believe Islam encourages violence more than any other faiths, and that 50% of Americans believe that Islam is not part of mainstream American society. And when we look at these numbers, we're actually comparing them with numbers from various other polls, which lead to the same conclusion. Vast majorities of Americans have very negative views and opinions about Muslims and Islam. Even if they know someone who is Muslim, they may consider that person as being an exception to the rule. Next slide. These attitudes often result, as you might imagine, in anti-Muslim discrimination. A poll by a prominent organization found that 60% of Muslims report religious discrimination. And this is compared with 58% of Jews, 26% of Catholics, and about 30% of Protestants. Numbers like this show us that Muslims are viewed and treated differently than other groups. The same poll also found that Muslims are more likely than other groups to experience religious discrimination in in institutional settings. For example, 44% of Muslims versus 5% of the general public at airport experience discrimination. 33% of Muslims versus 8% of the general public when applying for a job. The same when interacting with law enforcement, the same when receiving health care, and so forth. Now let's take a look at schools. Next slide. A survey by the same organization, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, found that 51% of Muslim families, that's 1 out of 2 Muslim families, say their child was bullied for their faith, double the level of families in the general public, which is 27%. I have been personally involved with anti-bullying efforts at the federal level under President Obama for 5 years with his Department of Education Secretary, Arne Duncan. What is learned there is that much of the bullying that occurs is ignored because adults believe that it's related to First Amendment rights, or the issue is just not taken seriously because adults might consider that that child deserves what they're getting because of a perception that Islam is behind the wars that we're involved in, or the terrorism that might have happened, and so forth. So it's no wonder that we have the numbers that we do. According to the Council on American Islamic Relations, based on surveys they've done here in California, which is one of the most progressive and tolerant states, 40% of students, Muslim students, report being bullied because of their faith. Verbal bullying is often associated with Muslims, being called bomber, killer, comments like Allahu Akbar, comments such as, "Hey, gonna bomb the school now," being said or shouted to Muslim kids. Girls wearing hijab often have their scarves offensively touched, in some cases pulled off. And what I find interesting is also that 35% of students report seeing posts containing offensive comments about Islam or Muslims in social media. So cyberbullying is a huge issue, as many of the educators now know. Next slide. And it's important to note that this bigotry is conveyed even by the adults in schools, which is, particularly troubling due to the power dynamic and the reality that students have little recourse in this case. Who are they going to report to if the adults themselves are behind the bullying? And also students may hesitate to share this even with their own parents. Both the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding reports found that 29% report school staff made derogatory statements about Muslims or Islam. 15% reported that school staff made offensive comments about Islam or Muslims, and 12% of students felt that their teacher did not teach about Islam in a neutral, fair, or factual manner, and why we recommend resources here. And these numbers are just based on the numbers that are reported. I can tell you, as a Muslim who wears the hijab, I experience it weekly, not daily, but weekly. And someone like me doesn't have time, to report these hate incidences, and I'm not unique in that. The next slide. Now, the impact of bullying and harassment can be significant for a student, and the results include depression and anxiety, difficulty sleeping, poor school adjustment, and even worsening academic performance. Muslim students describe their experiences in their own words. For example, one student shared that my teacher stereotyped Muslims and called on me to be the expert to explain horrific acts carried out by people in rural places of some Muslim countries I had never been to. Another one, people made fun of my religion and name. I would go home and tell my mom and cry in my room. Another one, I heard another student call a Muslim student a terrorist and felt scared to portray my faith. And there have been reports, other studies that have found that Muslim children often internalize Islamophobia, often internalize negative opinions about themselves as a result of not only what they're facing in schools by their classmates and by adults in the classroom, but also by what they see of themselves in American popular culture. It's a huge problem. It has been a problem. I can tell you, growing up in the United States myself, as an Arab and as a Muslim, it was something that I didn't want to identify with at all growing up in the United States. And this problem, of course, has gotten worse, unfortunately, because of what I described, and also it's been compounded by the wars that we've been involved in, and of course 9/11. Next slide. Now that we've looked at the origins and scope of the problem, the origins of Islamophobia and the scope of the problem of Islamophobia, we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about ways to counter Islamophobia specifically for educators. Next slide. We are going to discuss three major strategies of countering Islamophobia. The first step is to begin with yourself by challenging your own assumptions about this population. And of course, Muslims are people that have national origins and have ethnic backgrounds that stem from 50 Muslim majority countries around the world. And so there's a tremendous amount of diversity there, which we're going to talk about. So the first place, I think, is just to come to terms with maybe our own perceptions of this population. The second is we're going to recommend teaching tips and recommended resources when teaching about Muslims in the classroom. And we're going to conclude with ways to apply cultural sensitivity to Muslim students and their families that you might engage with. Next slide. Let's go ahead and begin with ways to counter one's own biases. Next slide. The best way to counter these biases is to learn more about Muslims and their religion from authentic and reliable sources. Now, at ING, we have online curricula created specifically for educators, which addresses the following topics in great detail: an overview of Muslim Americans and their faith. This is a PowerPoint presentation with scripts that you can access online. We also have lesson plans on this that are far more detailed that you can use, that are very specific to the content standards in social studies that teachers are required to teach at the national level and at the state level. History of Muslims in America, which looks at the long history of Muslims in the US, beginning with enslaved Africans, and as early as the 15th century. There are records that have indicated that Muslims from West Africa were here even before Columbus in the Americas, because of the discovery of terracottas, clay statues that had features of Africans in West Africa, from the head covering to the scarification of their face to the embedded earrings, that would indicate that these were Muslim Africans. And then, of course, Muslims have been immigrating to the United States since the mid-1800s. A lot of people don't know that. People just assume that, most Muslims are recent immigrants, or they're all immigrants. Muslim contributions to civilization. This is especially important when a teacher is teaching about cultural interactions between European and Eastern civilizations. The amount of contributions that Muslims make for 12 centuries, in not only in the sciences and in mathematics and astronomy and all the other sciences, but also in culture, in literature, and in all sorts of ways. Something that is not covered at all, or as well in the sources that currently exist. Women in Islam is another presentation which addresses common stereotypes and misconceptions about the topic. And we really complicate this issue by looking at Muslim women's, or the status of Muslim women in 50 Muslim majority countries. And it's, what you find is that it's a mixed bag. It's, in some cases, women have become heads of state. In other cases, women just gained their right to vote. So a lot of these issues have more to do with culture and history and tradition than they do with their religion. We also have answers to over 150 frequently asked questions about Islam, not just your general questions, but also specific questions about Sharia, for example, which is a topic right now that everyone is talking about in relation to the Taliban in Afghanistan. We have a book list about Muslims. You can also sign up to our listserv because we're constantly releasing new lesson plans. We just did on 9/11, where we looked at the impact of 9/11, not just on Muslim Americans, but other communities, Asian Americans, Latinx communities, African Americans, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and so forth. And we created lesson plans based on what they said on camera, what they said on video, which was really illuminating even for me, watching this and helping to create the lesson plan that followed. So we're always releasing new content, and so signing up to our listserv might be a good idea for you to receive new content that we get and that we release. And it's also important to just generally keep abreast of current events and policies relating to Muslims, so that you're aware of the issues that impact your students or that might lead to a spike in harassment or bullying. Next slide. A common stereotype about Muslims is that they're all the same. They're monolithic. And as I mentioned earlier, there are nearly 2 billion Muslims worldwide. About a quarter of the world's population is Muslim. They live in over 50 Muslim majority countries. There are also sizable minorities around the globe, in China, in Europe, in the former Russian republics, and so forth. And because they live in so many diverse places, Muslims are diverse by their nature, in their nationality, and in their race, languages, cultures, and so forth. And in fact, religion is only one factor in a Muslim's life. Additionally, Muslims, like all other faith adherents, vary in the practice of their faith. Some are nominally religious, while others are moderately religious, and some are very observant, and so forth. So this is where the diversity comes in. And then when you also look at education, economic class, family upbringing, mental health, political environment, all of those things determine a person's attitude. And it applies to Muslims as it would apply to Americans and just people around the world. Next slide. Another question to find out your level of knowledge and even challenge common biases is about Muslim female heads of state. How many Muslim majority countries have had female heads of state? Next slide. The answer is 12. 14 Muslim women have been heads of state in a dozen Muslim majority countries. And these include some of the largest Muslim majority countries, such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Turkey, as well as smaller ones, such as Kosovo, for example. Next slide. People often generalize about Muslim women when in fact they actually live extremely diverse lives, depending on the same factors that impact women worldwide. So there's diversity in the treatment of women. Factors such as education, profession, socioeconomic status, politics, all of those impact the lived experiences of Muslim women. And the bottom line, like women everywhere, some Muslim women enjoy rights, others don't. However, like women worldwide, a growing number of Muslim women are now well-educated professionals, physicians, engineers. Here in the United States, they are some of the most educated women in the country, next to Jewish women, African-American women, women hailing from countries like India and Pakistan and so forth. Next slide. It might also surprise people to know that violent extremism in the US is mainly committed by far-right extremists. So according to the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League, it's a very prominent Jewish civil rights organization. They report that in 2018, for example, 98% of extremist killings in the United States were by far-right extremists, and only 2% were by domestic extremists, Islamist extremists. And in the period between 2009 and 2018, right-wing extremists perpetrated 73% of domestic extremist-related killings in the US. Islamist extremists, 23%, and left-wing extremists, 3%, right? So terrorism is usually only associated with Muslim extremism when in fact it's not exclusive. Violence and terrorism is not exclusive to Muslims. You'll find it in different parts of the world, in places like Myanmar and in China against Muslims, in places like India against Muslims, in African countries by Christian terrorists, and so forth, and right here in the United States by white supremacists, groups like the KKK and militia groups and so forth. It's not exclusive of course, to just one group in the way that it's usually portrayed in the media. Next slide. We're now going to look at educator resources. We just finished talking about stereotypes and why it's important to challenge your own stereotypes first. And if you have them, right? We covered the idea that Muslims are monolithic, or that women don't have rights, or that extremism and violent extremism, terrorism is exclusive to Muslims. There's a lot more, of course, to learn about the people, about their religion, and the various ways that they understand it. The second area, of course, is to look for good, accurate, authentic resources that are balanced, right? That talk about the good and bad. And so we're going to share with you some of our material that I think that you'll find really useful, and we've been using it for 30 years. We've never had complaints. In fact, we've gotten nothing but really good feedback on it. Next slide. And so the first place is that we actually provide educator training, which addresses challenges faced by Muslim students in the current environment. So it expands on some of the things that we introduced to you today. We also talk about specific policies to prevent bullying and so forth. And it also covers guidelines for teaching about religion in general. We just did a webinar for another group on teaching about religion in general, not just teaching about Islam in world history and social studies. That isn't on here, but it is available. It's on our YouTube channel. The training also provides educational resources for teaching about Muslim history and culture. So you're going to get a little bit of that today. So next slide. So we provide presentations by Muslim Americans who are trained and certified by us, which supplement content standards for grades 6 through 12 in relation to Muslims and what is taught in world history and related subjects. And all of this is free of charge. We're funded by several foundations, San Francisco Foundation, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Haas, Rosenberg, Hellman Foundations, and so forth. So we're able to provide this free of charge for educators, because I know that many schools just don't have the funds to be able to do this. And these speakers come in with visual aids, with slide presentations, and they cover things like getting to know Muslim Americans and their faith, that addresses some of the history and some of the ways that Muslim Americans live their faith in the United States. Muslim contributions to civilization, a history of Muslim women beyond the stereotypes. Next slide. We also provide panels, interfaith panels, that feature representatives from the 5 major world faiths. We will also add Sikhism when requested. So we also cover that 6th major world faith. And again, our topics all supplement content standards for grades 6 to 12. And these are also available to the educators free of charge. So these panelists will talk about living the faith, what that means. Shared values among the faith is another topic that we do quite a bit of. religion and pluralism. What do each of these religions say about religious pluralism? Their relationship to other religious groups. Religion and extremism used to be a very popular topic. Women and religion, peacemaking, separation of church and state, and so forth. We also have one that specifically focuses on Muslim-Jewish panel that doesn't address the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as much as it addresses Muslim and Jewish Americans and what their shared concerns and interests are in the United States around anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, living our faith in a secular society, and so forth. It's a great panel for the kids to actually see Jews and Muslims getting along with each other. And in fact, the comments that we mostly get about this panel is that I can't believe that they all get along with each other, or I can't believe that they sound really normal, and how their values dictate much of their life. The other comments that we get is that I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Islam. I learned a lot about Buddhism, Hinduism, or Judaism, religions that I wasn't familiar with before. So it's a wonderful event for students, I think. Next slide. This is our newest program, and it's really exciting. It's called the Intercultural Speakers Bureau. And again, panels are free of charge. And what this panel and group of speakers do is they examine the origin and the impact of bigotry in the United States and what we can do about it. So it actually ends with calls to action about education, about different groups, and about ways to combat racism or to combat biases that we confront on a daily basis. And the panels consist of Americans of African, Hispanic, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Muslim, and Jewish backgrounds, discussing their histories and experiences of bigotry and racism, as well as strategies for countering them. And the second panel that we do here supplements 14 lesson plans that we provide for educators free of charge, funded by many of the foundations in the Bay Area, where the same group of panelists will come in and discuss what we want people to know about us. So that students will have done all of the work that we might have addressed in the first panel, but it's expanded upon, of course. And then the panel will come in and supplement the one of the lesson plans that deals with, now here, after you've learned about all of this, now what do we want you to know about us? And it's also a fun panel. Next slide. We also offer interactive curricula free of charge. So the Countering Racism consists of 14 lesson plans. And then all of the topics that we actually present about are also offered for teachers in the form of lesson plans with PowerPoints and with script. So a teacher may choose just to cover this material him or herself in the classroom instead of having a speaker. Of course, the advantage of having a speaker is that it brings the subject matter to life. And we're very careful to abide by separation of church and state and the way that we talk about religion in the public square. We're trained by the Freedom Forum in the way that you talk about religion in the public square in a way that doesn't proselytize, doesn't preach, that focuses on informing, raising awareness, without asserting that these are truths, but rather this is the understanding of how these different groups of people understand their religion and how they practice their religion as well. So it's I think well done. Next slide. And then of course we have online answers, as I mentioned earlier, from the most basic topics to more sophisticated ones relating to women, modernity, and Sharia, which is a question that people ask a lot about in relation, of course, to the Taliban. Next slide. Okay, so we're done with the resources, and now for the final part, we're going to talk about applying cultural sensitivity towards students and parents. Next slide. We'll begin first with parent engagement. As all of you know, parent involvement is important for both the academic and social success of their children in the school. Some Muslim parents, especially recent immigrants who have limited English fluency, may need extra encouragement and outreach to engage with their children's school. So you might want to make an extra effort to encourage parents to attend back to school night, open house, parent-teacher conferences, to volunteer in the classroom or school, to volunteer for social events such as international night, science fair, and so forth. And you might want to consider translation services for non-English speakers. Next slide. Student rights. As many of you know, student rights are protected by the First Amendment. They include, for instance, the right to wear religiously mandated clothing, like you see me wearing, the hijab, long sleeves, pants, loose-fitting pants, to observe dietary rules, not eating pork. Of course, alcohol is not an issue in school, but Muslims also, if they're practicing, they don't drink alcohol. They also include the right to engage in personal worship as long as it's not disruptive. The Equal Access Act of 1984 affirms the right of students to participate in student-initiated religious activities, and they include religious clubs and even the right to inform others about religion in an appropriate manner. The only way that you can stop a child from doing that is if the school has a policy not to share information about their religion. But students pretty much have religious freedoms based on the First Amendment. Other student rights included. Next slide. They include a protection from harm, which means physical safety on school premises, as well as safety from emotional stress. So bullying is supposed to be responded to immediately. In a timely fashion, any form of bullying, including harassment, even if the perpetrator claims it is in jest, if the child is hurt by it, it becomes a problem. Things to avoid. Next slide. Include making fun of or punishing students for wearing hijab or other religious clothing, or forbidding them to do so. And we're raising up issues that have actually come up, which is why we have it on the slide. Making fun of a student's name, country of origin or religion, praising or criticizing one's religion over another, or suggesting that a student should convert to another religion for any reason, right? You wouldn't want to do that for any child, of course, for any religion for that matter. Or you might be somebody who's not religious, that would apply to somebody who is religious, right? And and vice versa. If you're very religious and you come across children who come from homes where they don't believe in God and they don't practice any religion, you can't impose your religious views on them either. Another issue is avoid using biased or inaccurate teaching material. For example, teaching about 9/11 in elementary schools without any other context or background about Muslims. And additionally, the subject may not be suitable for that age group, for example, right? And I encourage you to look at our 9/11 lesson plan, which I think you'll find really interesting, because it doesn't just address the impact on Muslim Americans, it actually addresses the impact on America and Americans. Avoid using stereotypical films like Not Without My Daughter, or fictional books to teach about Islam like Shabano, which serve not only to demonize Muslims, but they create an environment where Muslim students are ashamed or humiliated, feel humiliated for their faith. Next slide. Applying cultural sensitivity. What do we mean by that? Well, just to be aware that diet of Muslims, most Muslims, is that they don't eat pork or pork byproducts, which also includes a favorite kids' food, gelatin. A dress. Some girls wear hijab, which they will not take off in public. And girls who wear hijab may be more likely to be targeted for harassment or bullying. Another is gender relations. Some students may avoid partnering with the opposite gender during lab, right? Or because of the close proximity between the students, for example, right? Well, if you feel there's discomfort there, you might want to approach the girl to find out if she'd like to have another partner for any reason, or wait for them to come to you to say that they're feeling uncomfortable. Never assume. You don't want to assume, but this is just sort of for your information that this may happen. For phys ed, some students may request to be excused from swimming or dancing or asked to wear sweats under the shorts. Prayers, some students may ask to pray noon prayer at school in an empty classroom or library. And as we addressed earlier, due to First Amendment rights, teachers have to accommodate them. Fasting in the month of Ramadan, fasting students may request to go to the library during lunch. They may also ask to be excused from rigorous PE activities. Holidays, lunar calendar rotates around the year, so it's important to update the calendar every year. We just released an updated calendar, and it's part of our resources for educators, which I'm going to give you the web address for. Next slide, work to prevent bullying. Bullying prevention really means creating an inclusive environment for all students. And to that end, you want to promote school-wide activities. You want to address prejudice and its roots in the classroom or school-wide through discussions and assemblies. Have students share their own experiences if they're comfortable doing so. Invite guest speakers to address stereotypes. We're happy to do that both online or in person, depending on where we have our speakers. Exhibit sensitivity in classroom discussions about conflict during times of crisis. And remember that some of these conflicts are related to students in the classroom that may have relatives living in those places still. And so it becomes a triggering issue for them talking about it. Next slide. And definitely address bullying when it happens. It's critical to do that. You want to be aware and recognize the problem. You want to have a zero tolerance policy with clearly articulated policies that are enforced. Mediate bullying with all parties. And if problem persists, you want to involve the parents. It's also important to acknowledge and address personal views of teachers and staff on current events and issues. You want to hold staff sensitivity, culture diversity workshops to help address stereotypes and misconceptions. Next slide. And I think I will go ahead and end here just based on the time. You can find all of these resources and classroom tools that we've discussed in one place, all on our website by going to this link, ing.org/educator-toolkit. And it includes our updated Muslim school calendar, a new 9/11 lesson plan that looks at the impact of 9/11, not just on Muslim Americans, but all Americans of other religious, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. I found it incredibly fascinating to watch myself. And with that, I will go ahead and end. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today and hope that it was useful. And together we can create a better classroom and a school environment for all the diverse students in California and actually around the country. Thank you so much.